One thing I thought maybe you could give us a little insight on is a high level of the research you've been conducting recently, and maybe we'll build on some of those concepts as we talk further.
Okay. So there's a very standard view of dishonesty. And the standard view of dishonesty is that people do the cost-benefit analysis. Every time you pass by a gas station, you should ask yourself, what's in the till? How much money is in the till? What's the chance of being caught? How much time will I get in prison? And we weigh the cost and benefit. And that's the economic model. And it's not just the economic model, it's the way we think of preventing crime. Because the way we think about it is we say, as long as the punishment at the end will have a high probability of being caught and a big punishment, then people would not commit crime. But it turns out across all of human experience, we have very few things that we think about the long term. Think about lots of other things. For example, dieting, texting while driving, unprotected sex. I mean, there's lots of things in life that show us that we're not good in thinking about the long term. On top of that, in crime, when we look, for example, at the effect of the death penalty, you can say, is it the case that states that have the death penalty have a lower crime rate? If they do, it means that people say, oh, this is a particular crime, I could get the death penalty, not worth it. There's no evidence for that. So if people don't think about the long-term consequences of their actions, this kind of model is not going to be helpful, and imposing big punishments are not going to deter crime. So then the question is, instead, what does work? And what we find in general is that people have two goals. On one hand, we want to look at ourselves in the mirror and feel that we're good, honest, wonderful people. We get some pleasure out of this, some utility. On the other hand, we want to benefit from being dishonest. That's the selfish part of us. It's not the only part, but it's one part of it. Now, you could say you can't do both. You can't think of yourself as honest and be dishonest. Well, it turns out you can. As long as you cheat just a little bit.
So you don't tilt the scale.
Too much.
Yeah.
You can cheat a little bit and still think of yourself as honest, as an honest person. And the key thing to understand in this delicate balance is that rationalization is centrally important. Why? Because the moment you can rationalize your behavior to a higher degree, it's easier to cheat more and still think of yourself as honest. And now what we've done across many studies is to examine this role of rationalization. And every place we go, we find that everything that increases rationalization, cheating goes up. Everything that decreases rationalization, cheating goes down. When we play with the economic factors, for example, we give people more gain if they steal, or we increase the probability of being caught, we see almost no effect of that. But the moment we start changing rationalization, we see huge differences in this honesty.
Regardless of the penalty or regardless of the deterrent, they can rationalize to themselves the behavior.
That's right.
We spend a lot of our time talking with companies around building their compliance program, putting mechanisms in place to identify some of this activity.
Yes.
Hopefully prevent it if you can, right? That would be the ultimate goal. But how do you try to figure out where that line is? You know, if you know where the line is, it seems like you can maybe manage that balance a little better in your favor.
I think it's all about the theory of the person. When you're setting up regulation to decrease dishonesty, you're trying to understand what is the psychology of the person and what would therefore decrease it. And the usual standard approach is to say big punishment. I mean, imagine that any company started creating death penalty for people who are doing stuff. The assumption is people would just stop doing everything and behave well. Well, I think they might do it for a few days, but not for longer. I think the other approach is to say, let's think about rationalization. And basically what we find is that there's a few crucial elements. The first one is that you need to have a motivated force to see reality in a different way. It could be money, prestige, all kinds of things. The next thing you need is fuzzy laws. When you have incredibly fixed rules, then you know if on your right side or the left side. And then the third thing is rationalization. So I think what companies need to understand is to attack those three principles. They need to attack motivated conflicts of interest, which we have tremendous amount of them in many industries. The second thing is we need to create less fuzzy rules. And finally, we need to decrease rationalization.
Conflicts of interest is something that it's a reality, right? There's always going to be inherent conflicts. The challenge for companies is to get people to talk about those things. Now, in that rationalization concept, is there a tie where people would tend to downplay the impact of a conflict on their actions? Or
So first of all, I think that people don't understand how big they are. You know, I was recently in a big medical conference and I asked 2,000 physicians, and I asked them, how many of you think that your decisions about your patients are influenced by conflicts of interest? Silence. And then I asked them, how many of you think the majority of other people in the room have severe conflicts of interest problem? Everybody raised their hands.
Right.
Now, this is the thing. You don't see how you're influenced. It's a wonderful thing about human nature, of how we make connection and start caring about somebody. But the moment I met you, you bought me coffee, we talked a little bit about where you live and I live, and now we have a connection. And now I can't help by seeing reality slightly from your perspective. So conflicts of interest are endemic and problematic, and we need to eliminate them to the degree we can, or at least reduce them. Now, many companies are using what we call the sunshine policy, or disclosure.
Yes.
And the question is this working? So there's not that many experiments about it, but we've done a couple, and George Lowenstein and his colleague have done a couple. And here's what happens. So imagine I'm your financial advisor, and you're my client. And in one case, I just say, buy stock B. And I tell you to buy stock B because it's better for me than if you buy stock A. Now imagine a second case in which I need to disclose. So now I still say buy the same stock, but I say, but just so you know, I get paid more money. If I disclose my conflicts of interest, you're going to discount my opinion.
Right.
But what will happen to me when I disclose? Turns out people are more willing to lie or to exaggerate to a higher degree. And from those two forces, what so far the results show is the person who's disclosing is exaggerating even further and making the situation actually worse. Every time I disclose, it can have two effects. One is I could stop exaggerating, or you could discount my opinion to a higher degree. These are both very unlikely things. So now the question is what will happen in this game between two people, and so far it's not as effective. So I think disclosure is not enough. It kind of puts us at ease because we haven't really thought about it too carefully.
Right.
We just said disclosure, let's solve it. And we love fuzzy rules. Fuzzy rules are good because you can exercise your judgment.
We come into a situation, the first thing is, the question is, do you have policies and procedures? So you could talk around a sensitive area, making a gift, entertaining someone, travel, etc. Sometimes the situation is they have no policies and procedures. Well, we know that's not the right answer.
Yeah.
Other times they have written policies that are never followed, or the policies are vague.
That's right.
And that's it sounds like what you're talking about, where everyone can look at it and interpret it a little differently.
That's right. And every time you interpret something a little different, there's a risk people would interpret it in a way that is good for them in a selfish, short-term perspective. I've talked to lots of big cheaters. I do lab experiments, but nobody that I've talked to actually thought about the long-term consequences of their actions, and it was always about justifying just one step, and one step, and one step, and thinking this was actually somehow okay in some universe. So I think clear rules are incredibly important. They're very hard to write down,
Sure.
but it's worthwhile to think about, maybe not every area, but sensitive areas. Here's the experiment we did on this. Our basic experiments look like this. We take a sheet of paper with 20 simple math problems, and we tell people, solve as many of those as you can in 5 minutes, we'll give you $1 per question. People work as hard as they can. At the end of the 5 minutes, we say, stop, put your pencil down, and count how many questions you got correctly. Now take the sheet and go to the back of the room and shred it. And come back to the front of the room and tell us how many questions you got correctly.
And no one observes it in the meanwhile.
Nobody observes it. People do this, they report 6 questions, we pay them $6, they go home. What the people in the experiment don't know is that we fixed the shredder. So the shredder only shreds the sides of the page, but the main body of the page remains intact, and we can find out how many questions they really solve. What do we find? People solve 4 questions. On average, people solve 4 and report 6. By the way, across all my research, we've done about 30,000 people so far. From these 30,000 people, we found 12 people who cheated a lot. And in total, they stole about $150 from me. And we found 18,000 people who cheated a little. And they stole $36,000.
Just a small margin.
That's right. And they stole $36,000. Now think about it. Big cheaters, really sad, and we focus on them. Tiny economic impact, $150. Little cheaters, $36,000. Just think about the economic magnitude of those two differences.
So you think that what we're seeing in the press every day, these are the big cheaters, the ones that are rolling the dice and getting caught?
I think we see some of the big cheaters. We also see some of the little cheaters that started little and then at some point got to a state that they couldn't go back.
Right.
So we see those as well. I think the slippery slope is an important issue. But when you ask whether these people took the first step, are they different than you and me, or they're just you and me in a slightly different situation? I would vote that they're just like you and me in a slightly different situation.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I've been doing these fraud investigations of forensic accounting for a number of years, and we've always seen that what starts out small grows. Mm-hmm. So it almost seems like it could be a mistake or a bookkeeping error or an oversight. Yep. And someone realizes at the end of the month or the quarter that no one asks a question. It doesn't get caught. Yeah. So that grows. And after a few months or years of that, then they kind of venture out into other areas. So I'm not sure, if it's a theory of the rationalization again, that I've got something due to me, or no one's looking over my shoulder. But does your experience show that as well?
So first of all, I think that the distance is important. So let's go one step back. Think about our experiment with the shredding. We did another version in which people finished shredding, they came to the experiment and they looked them in the eye and said, Mr. Experiment, I solved such and such number of problems, give me tokens. And we gave them a token for each question. They walked 12 feet to the side and changed it for dollars. What happened in this case? When you look into somebody in the eyes, you don't lie for money, you lie for tokens. But it becomes money very quickly. Our participants doubled their cheating.
That's interesting.
And the idea is that cheating directly for money is tough because you can't but help yourself as a thief. I mean, think about the difference between taking 50 cents from a petty cash box and taking a pencil from the office. Even if you took 50 cents and bought a pencil, it would still feel different.
Right.
So this distance is incredibly important. And of course,
from
accounting,
the ultimate benefit that
That's
you're
right.
getting from the activity.
it's from the ultimate person that you're stealing from. It's from the ultimate act. It's from money. I mean, everything that becomes more and more steps helps us rationalize things. The ability of humans to rationalize is just incredible. We've done these experiments. Imagine an experiment in which you cheat for yourself, another experiment in which you get to play with a team member. And if you exaggerate, they also get to benefit. What happens now? Cheating goes up even further.
A collective cheating.
That's right. We call it altruistic cheating, right? Because now you benefit somebody else. And what happens if you take these two people and you make them good friends? It goes even further.
But is the idea that my rationalization feeds off of yours or vice versa?
No, the idea is that all of a sudden you think about my benefit. And because you think about my benefit, you can rationalize it to a higher degree. You're not really doing it for yourself, you're doing it for somebody else, somebody you like.
Now, does this touch a little bit on like the group mentality as well? So in other words, if I come into an environment and I observe your behavior,
Yes.
and you're rationalizing or justifying and maybe you're going along the edges to your benefit, does that then change my view of how I should act? Or?
Tremendous. So there is the general idea that we know what's right and wrong legally, but there's also the evolving social norms. So what's important is we follow the herd in cheating. Other people define what we find is acceptable and not acceptable, but it's only people that we find relevant. Right? And because of that, I think the evolving culture within a company is incredibly important. Now here's another way to think about it. You can take lots of activities in life and think about how much guilt is connected with each of them. And I'll give you two examples. In the last few years, every time I go to a restaurant, I always ask the waiter if there's a way to eat and not pay. I start by saying, look, I'm not really going to do it. I'm just curious, if I wanted to.
Did they find a way for you?
Aside from one time, they always give me a way. 2 weeks ago, by the way, I sat in a coffee shop for 5 hours. I had five meetings, one after the other. When I finished, I totally forgot. I just left without paying. Nobody stopped me. I mean, it's really easy to do. I went back. I paid them. It's okay. But it's incredibly easy. And then I asked them, and how often do people do it? Almost never.
Interesting.
On the other hand, you look at illegal downloads, right? And you talk to young people, they feel like they're doing some justice to society. They say, oh, the musicians want the music to be heard, and record companies are evil, and it doesn't cost anybody anything.
It's too expensive to begin with. It shouldn't cost that much.
These are people who love these musicians. And nevertheless, they're taking money out of their pocket. Now, they would never take a penny out of that musician's pocket because they love them. But doing it this way, with so many ways of rationalizing, it feels very different.
And it's distant.
And it's distant,
your point.
right? It's incredibly easy. So now, think about guilt. We have some activities that you can't help but feel guilty about. And then the other activities, like illegal downloads for young people, that are basically like corruption. When you get to that level, it's just about the cost-benefit analysis. Right. There's nothing internal that stops you. Now, the thing is that if you start with something that people feel guilty, you could reduce it over time. That's what happened to corrupt societies. In the US, paying a policeman off to get you off a fine, you would feel embarrassed about it. Over time, if more and more people do it, and we think it's more and more normative, in the sense that everybody's doing it, the guilt would go away, and then we only have the cost-benefit to fight. Now, the thing is that fighting dishonesty with cost-benefit is very, very difficult and very expensive. So what we need to do is to try and nourish the guilt component, people's moral sense of what's right and what's wrong. And the local culture, both the country, society, and the company, is incredibly important on that. If a company is investing in getting people to have some moral thoughts and guilt or regret, then controlling dishonesty is much cheaper. The moment all that goes away, now you're left with cost benefit, incredibly, incredibly hard to do.
Well, let's talk about the culture point, because it seems like there's a couple of different cultures at play. So one could be the corporate culture, and I think you mentioned that.
Yeah.
And one could be, especially for a multinational company, you're in emerging markets, you're in far off places, distant from the headquarters. It seems like that's a real challenge to try to come up with concrete policies and guidance that people can follow, and that you can try to maybe even incentivize or enforce good behavior.
What people actually see is probably going to overwhelm dramatically what they know. So if I take you and I put you in a position where you see people around you misbehaving and paying bribes, doing whatever, playing with the numbers, it would not take very long for you to buy into that perspective. So I think it's kind of nice to have a global policy, but the important thing to control are the details on the street. This notion for herding, for following other people, is something incredibly important.
Right.
You know, the British government is doing all kind of experiments. They have a new office for behavioral economics, and they do all kind of experiments. And in one experiment, they tried to get people to pay their taxes on time, and they tried to frighten, and they tried all kinds of things. You know what helped? Sending people a letter that's saying 9 out of 10 people in your district have already paid their taxes. This increased tax compliance by 15%.
Because now you feel like you're outside of
Everybody
the norm.
else is doing it. It's time I do it as well. This idea of following up what other people are doing is incredibly important. Now, does somebody who's in a field office know what's happening in the home office 3,000 miles away? Very unlikely. Are they likely to follow the example of people around them? Incredibly so. So that's why that behavior, I think, is probably more important than the standards and policy that people establish.
Now, can I create, is there a way, let's say I'm a compliance officer or a general counsel at a company, and I want to try to create some better behavior. So we've seen examples of communication. You know, let's talk about what our values are. Let's talk about the standards, even minimum standards we want our employees to follow. We've seen cases of let's talk about where there has been wrongdoing and how that's been handled by the company. I mean, do you think some of those things are effective, or do you think companies should be thinking of newer or creative ways to handle the risk?
So I think, you know, talking about stuff is often not enough. If I covered your desk every morning with donuts and muffins, and then I came and gave you lectures on healthy behavior, it's just not going to work very well. So I think companies do put tremendous temptation in front of people in terms of misbehavior, and then they say, hey, by the way, but don't take this temptation. I think that's kind of a wrong approach. I do think that we need to keep on reminding people where the lines are. So I think we need to take examples of bad behavior and say we're not going to tolerate that. And I think we need to take examples of good behavior, which, by the way, we almost never do, and say this is how we view things. And I think this reinforcement is actually important. You know, again, if you look at the behavior of people around you, what lessons do you usually learn? Usually don't see the good people. You see the bad people misstepping. So there's a tendency, I think, to shift in the wrong direction. So I think companies need to remind people from time to time about this is unacceptable, and here's the good behavior. But on top of that, I think the rules need to be stricter. And I'm a big believer in professional code of standard of ethics or code of conduct. And we did an experiment at UCLA, which we asked 500 students to try and recall the 10 Commandments. None of them could recall all 10 Commandments. They invented all kinds of new ones. That's a different story. But what happened after they tried to recall the 10 Commandments? No cheating whatsoever in our experiment. Right? And this did not happen that the more religious people, the people who remembered more, didn't cheat, and the people who didn't remember any commandment cheated a lot.
It was across the board.
Across the board. Now think about it. What does it mean? It means that the moment you remind people about their moral standards, they do behave better. You basically think about yourself in a moral sense, and you can't rationalize to the same degree. Now, we did this study also at Princeton. Princeton has a very strong honor code. They take the freshmen, they put them through a week-long training on morality. Lectures, discussion, the a cappella group has a song about morality. What happened to the Princeton students? When they don't sign the honor code, they cheat a little bit. When they sign the honor code, they don't. So this is kind of good news, bad news. The good news, or the bad news, is that 1 week-long crash course on morality is not going to cut it, most likely, at least not the Princeton.
You need to follow up. You need to stay in touch.
You need to give examples. It's just not a one-time thing. The good news is that when you remind people about the moral standards, even if it's a particular thing that they don't have, just before temptation, it helps. I studied cheating. It's a very sad thing because people cheat a lot. The good news is that we don't cheat enough. Right? I mean, think about it. In the economic sense, you should cheat every time you get a chance to get something and not pay for it.
That's the cost-benefit
That's the
analysis that you
cost-benefit.
talked about earlier.
Now, that's the good thing. It's an incredibly wonderful thing about human nature. We're not doing the cost-benefit analysis. The problem, of course, is that we don't do enough of that. So we need to think about how to play with the good part of us and not to worry so much about the cost-benefit analysis.
Like reinforce the good behavior, because I'm taking some good lessons away from this. You know, making people feel closer to the company,
Yep.
closer to the individuals, right? A sense
That's
of
right.
responsibility around it,
Yep.
and then communication, staying in front of them, talking about it, reinforcing good behavior.
right.
Maybe not just making examples of the bad behavior, but showing where people have acted good in the company.
That's right.
I mean, it sounds like some basic steps.
And code of ethics, right? A professional code of ethics. Here are the things we do and here are the things we don't do. I recently talked to a head lawyer in a big company that does all kinds of deals outside, and he basically gave an order to all his lawyers never to give bribe. Lots of places accept bribe, and he said, here's the sentence that you say. You say, I'm sorry, but my boss, and his name, is not allowing me to do it. I really want to, but I can't. Right? So he created an incredibly strict rule. He said, it's not up to your judgment. This is not what we do, and here is what you say. And
Blame
here's
it
how
on
things
me.
and
Yep.
and this is how life is, and these are the codes that we live in. And you know, I think that people would actually be happier with that code. I think that living in a gray zone and asking yourself questions all the time about what's okay and what's not okay, and are you pushing it too much and so on, is just not a good way to live. And I think that many times people cheat. I mean, we think of people as cheating for their own self-benefit. Lots of time people are cheating for a collective, for the group, for the company. They kind of feel pressure to do it. And we really need to think about how to decrease that pressure.
Well, the gray bothers me a little bit. And when we talk with management of our clients, it's how do you know? You need consistency. You know, you need to be able to monitor the activity. You need to know that it's consistent. So whether it's how things are being recorded in the books, how management is carrying out some of the directives and the strategy, and I think the gray does not allow you to have that kind of a comparison.
Yeah, and the moment you have gray scale, like what lesson are you giving people?
Right.
What is the right way to do things? So that I think are kind of the big lessons, and it's both a kind of a sad story and a good story, right? The sad story is how much we can rationalize. The good story is that there's sufficiently good about human nature that if we just thought about how to harness and build on it, we could do better.
We spend a lot of time in conversations and doing some of our own studies around the profile of someone that may commit, some misconduct. And, you say, is it a male? Is it a female? What are the age ranges? What kind of backgrounds do they have? And obviously the interest would be if we could profile the person, we would know up front, are we hiring them?
Yeah.
Are they in a position of trust at the company? From your research, have you seen any indicators that you can draw out of in terms of profiling?
So the general answer is no. Now, of course, there are psychopaths out there, right? There are kind of very, very few people who are just out there for their own benefit. But the small cheating that we talk about, which is something that we can all do and we can all take one step and then continue, we haven't found any profile for that. Now, we haven't gone too deep into it. Intelligence, by the way, doesn't matter. It's creativity. So I think, again, we have a tendency to look at good people and bad people. And of course, there are bad people out there. And there are psychopaths out there and there are people that don't care. And it's important to spend some time on it. But the reality is that I suspect that the amount of financial devastation to companies come from the small cheaters, not from the big cheaters.